Guest lecture. A warm welcome to Hartosh Singh Bal, a distinguished political journalist in the country. An engineer and mathematician by training, he's now one of our leading journalists and commentators. He is presently at work on a book on the 1984 violence against Sikhs in Delhi. His talk today is titled, "What's Wrong with the Media and What Might We Do About It?" Hartosh.
Everybody can hear me? My voice is clear, sure. Okay, so, the talk itself says what's wrong with the media and what we should do about it. And I think there's a brief synopsis which says that I will start and mainly focus on the English media. Let me just give you my excuse for doing so. Because unfortunately or fortunately, whether we like it or not, our discourse, media discourse, is governed by English. Today, if you're sitting here, you want to get news about UP, Bihar, etc., how they influence this country, and they do influence the country in very important ways. That news, when it is reported in this state, even by the vernacular media, is mediated by the English media. It comes to you by the English media, and the same messaging takes place the other way around. When the North, Punjab or Haryana is to read about what's happening in Karnataka, it happens through the English media. Just this very process itself ensures that the distortions of the English media creep into every vernacular media as it is. So, if we look at the problems of the English media in the largest possible sense, you will see that the same problems are present in vernacular media in some way or the other. They are embodied, are carried down from the English media. English media has that kind of influence, fortunately or unfortunately, whether we like it or not. So that is the reason that I'm talking about largely the English media, and we are talking of the current scenario where the English media exists today, what kind of English media we have today in the country. And at the heart of every such model is the question of economics, revenue, what drives the media, where does the money come from, what does it impose on the media. And I'll just point out that we are looking at the media in 2015, post-liberalization scenario. 1992 is a long way behind us. The media has adopted a particular economic model which has only grown in strength. That is, our media is basically funded by advertising. The price that we pay as consumers from buying media is a very small part of the revenue of the media. Much of that price comes from advertising. We can make sort of many conclusions from it, but let me try and summarize it. And that's the only reason I needed a pen, and they are lying there. That's the one reason I asked for it. And so maybe if I just briefly, a little diagram, if you will bear with me, is that if you look at any product sold by any company, take say somebody selling biscuits, It's being sold to the consumer. I'm using these terms liberally. This is the product. This is a fixed product. It can't be changed. The company has already manufactured it. It cannot be. And then the manufacturer pays the advertiser. This is money. And this is a messaging. Simple, model, what is happening is that the advertiser is adapting the messaging to the product here. The product is fixed, and the advertising is making sure that you get the right kind of information, the communication about what kind of product it is. What is happening with the media, And let me put it down just next to this so that you quite clearly understand what happens with. And I think people always get the wrong end when we look at media and revenue, because actually, and Sameer Jain has got it exactly right, what this model does is the advertiser, and bear with me, is selling the product. The advertisement that is coming to you is not changeable. He has already made the advertising. He wants to communicate that advertising to you. The advertiser pays money to the media. and the media is messaging to the consumer. If you want to look at it, the confusion often happens is because these two words are used in different senses in these models of what is happening before us. The advertiser's product, which is the ad, is unchangeable. The advertiser is paying the money. The only adaptable product here is the messaging. It's the news you get. It is the equivalent of the messaging that is happening where the advertiser is concerned. So in this revenue model, the only thing that can actually change is this. And depending on how much clout the advertiser has, the media messages in agreement or coherence with what the advertiser wants you to message. So I'm just simply trying to tell you that inherent in this model, we often say that this is what happens, this distortion is brought into the media. But inherent in this revenue model is the fact that the media, if it has to survive and get the money it needs for its survival, will have to adapt its message or the product it is selling to the consumer in tune with the advertiser. There is no way to escape this in this kind of scenario. This is the scenario we have chosen for ourselves. I don't mean as a society, but this is where we have reached. The preponderance of advertising money in media is such that its influence not only should not be neglected, it is the prime driver for the kind of news choices media makes to get to the consumer. Okay, so what are the implications of something like this? Does this necessarily mean that we have bad media? For example, and Chandan had mentioned that I was working on a book in 1984. One of the parallels that you look at is that I think the two worst instances of ethnic or communal massacres in the country were 1984 and 2002. 84 was pre-liberalization, the old standard media, slightly hidebound. 2002 was after this. And I'd argue actually that the media acquitted itself far better in 2002 than it did in 1984. In 1984, there was only one newspaper which actually sent out a reporter and took a critical stance. The Times of India was actually writing editorial more or less in support of the violence that was unfolding in the city around it. Girilal Jain's editorial is worth going back to and reading at that point of time. There was no television. The sense of outrage did not happen in that country. So on certain events, when they impinge on us directly, when they are newsworthy, I think even mass media can act in ways which is actually an improvement. The mass media has huge spread in this country. I mean, one of the things that I have noticed, and I have served as a journalist in districts and towns, states, living outside Delhi for several years, that is, if you go to a small town today, anywhere in the country, whether it is in Karnataka, whether it is in Madhya Pradesh, what you will find is that there are 3-4 stringers with cameras, each of them supplying news clips to various channels. And the kind of news clips that they supply, they are often, in these small towns, affiliated to some local interest or the other. They are controlled by local interests. And often these people are crooks, if I may use the term. But in this competition of 3 or 4 local crooks who have their local reporters, it often happens that very little goes unreported in this. Just the spread of mass media, the set of competing crooked interests can also ensure that there is an emergence of news at a certain level. This is the kind of news we were not getting out in the country earlier. Before the spread of mass media, you were not getting this kind of local news out. So there are advantages, disadvantages, but then you start looking at what happens. So immediate news, something that is of great interest, yes, will spark interest. Take something like long-term writing in terms of ethnic conflict, or let's say 3 or 4 years after the event, somebody is to do a series of stories from across the country on ethnic conflict. You'll find that those kind of stories still have a lot of viewership, readership. But that's the kind of story advertisers would not like to be associated with. Okay? So you're far less likely to see those stories, even though there is viewer interest in those stories. And then you come to a third set of stories. and I think all of you would be very familiar with it, is stories on, say, public education, public health. The advertiser is not interested in it. Often the viewer is not interested in it, and so you very rarely see it in the media at all. Basically. So there are grades of the kind of stories or the kind of things that get covered in the media, and much of it to do is to see with who is exercising what kind of influence. Now, in this scenario, where the advertiser has a major say of how the media conducts itself, let's look at how the media scenario has actually emerged and where it is headed. Post 1992, and I often remarked on this, that if you look at new media launches, I'm not talking about old established media houses, new media launches. So let me name some. We are talking of the English media post 1992, NDTV, CNN IBN, Outlook, DNA newspaper, Open magazine, smaller organizations, but name any that you can think of. I'm not talking of Times now, it comes from an old established brand, Times of India. Today, not one of them is making money. Not one new English media product post 1992 that has been launched is making money. There are other institutions like Times now, you can take older newspapers, the Times of India, Hindustan Times, they are making money. In this scenario, when media is mass, older established brands get reinforced, new brands have enormous difficulty establishing themselves. This was not the case. If you had actually looked at the scenario in 2008, you would assume that NDTV, Outlook were probably not in a crisis. We had the economic downturn for various different reasons. Something like Outlook print is a different story from TV, but NDTV, CNN, IBN had expanded so rapidly, and they had, this is true of Outlook also, all of them had expanded in ways which had nothing to do with its core. The core, as you and I would imagine it, if we thought the media was a business about news. They had both expanded into covering travel, into covering entertainment. They had expanded into covering lifestyle. Why were they doing it? Because they were vehicles for advertising. You have to understand the business is of maximizing the kind of products you can offer to advertisers. That is the business in which media is in this country. They had expanded in that fashion. The problem with this model is that it is also, this model, media in this model, is a bellwether for recession. The first thing that any company in an economic downturn cuts down on is this money. Long before the recession hits any other sector, you start seeing its impact in media. The first thing that gets cut is your advertising budget, money coming into the media. If you put all these facts together, what I'm saying is that this advertising revenue model, one, is a very fragile model for new media because every economic downturn you are hit by very strong forces that push you towards losses or closure. The reason most of the brands that I have told you have not closed down is largely, and let me step out and say this, that bar one or two, is not because people think that they will become economically viable in the future, is because they are important sources of influence peddling in this country. They do not justify themselves as economic businesses. They are used by owners or people who put money into them to barter influence with the government so that people who put in the money can gain that money back in other associated businesses that they are involved with. This is the reason some of the brands survive, not because the model itself is sustainable. So the model is fragile. It tends to reinforce old, bigger players. It tends to create large, big monopolies of media. New competitors have a very difficult time establishing themselves. And this is the scenario you see before us. This is the scenario we face. This is the scenario that dictates the kind of news that comes to us, that is the kind of information that we process and that we deal with. Now, the question that I want to bring to your attention is that a lot of people in such a scenario presume and often advocate that the move to digital or online is going to change all this. So let me be a great skeptic of the digital sort of revolution in media. The problem is, in this model, it is not in the medium, whether it is print or television or already online advertising. I was speaking to, and this is due to sort of my prior contacts, one of my friends from Pulani heads in India what is called Group M, which is the largest media buying house. What does a media buying house do? It acts between advertisers and the media. It buys up chunks of the media and places advertising there. They decide which part of the media gets how much money of the advertisers pie. And already their business from digital has outstripped their business from all other traditional forms of media. Online advertising has already exceeded, in terms of sheer numbers, the advertising available for print, or it will in a couple of years, if I'm not mistaken. So what does this mean for news organizations which are shifting online? And what I'm proposing is that you will get much the same structure. This belief that small, fast organizations will provide you news which will give you alternatives is simply not true, because advertising online will look for what it looks offline. It looks for large numbers. Large numbers will only be provided by large media houses who can invest money over a long period of time in terms of attracting those numbers. So you are going to already in this model get the same kind of media online that you already have offline, that you already have on television, that you have certain channels, certain newspapers, very large, and then very little aside besides that which provides the alternative news sources. So I don't think online in such a circumstances is a solution or is going to do anything to change it. Now in this, I've concentrated very little on what an individual journalist can do, what it is an individual journalist's responsibility, how can an individual journalist make differences. The simple fact is, while these differences can be made, interventions are important, the kind of stand individual journalists take, the kind of conscience they bring to the profession makes a difference. But they cannot change the essential fact that because of the economic profile of my readership, because of the very nature of my revenue source, that there will be certain kind of stories which will remain outside my bound. I will not be able to engage with them in the way I would like to as an individual. There is nothing I can do about it. That is inbuilt into the kind of model we have chosen for the media. So the question is, are there ways out? Is there anything that can be done in terms of providing alternate perspectives, looking at what alternatives are available? How do we come up with solutions and suggestions that can change this possibility? To me, the one possibility, the ideal possibility, is actually to erase a large part of this revenue chain. And everybody has wanted to do it, that the only way media is going to work is if it's a direct communication between the media and the reader is paying for the media that the reader consumes. There is no third-party involvement at all. What does that mean? It's going back to the old-fashioned way of saying that, media should pay for itself through the circulation that a consumer provides. As long as the advertising model exists, this is just not possible. The Times of India, because of its huge advertising revenue, sells copies at prices that somebody who's selling directly to the consumer will never be able to match, because the Times of India is making actually a loss per copy in terms of the production value and the money that is returning. Advertisement supplements that money. Not only supplements it, increases it manifold. So you cannot, in print, hope to have this consensus. Magazines which are suffering the most today, because magazine readers are most attuned to online, they are the best educated, so magazine circulations have already declined. The death of the print magazine is before us in some ways or the other. Even though they've raised their price per copy, say India Today I think costs about 20 rupees, today Outlook costs the same. This money is just enough to recover the production cost, which means this money does nothing to cover the expense of salaries, of news gathering, of advertising departments, circulation departments. All that is paid for by advertising, basically. The advantage online has is that you don't need huge infrastructure. You don't need paper, you don't need printing, you can cut down costs by a large amount. In my own understanding, to run, again online, you cannot be too large. If you want to compete with the dailies, compete on daily news, the kind of infrastructure, the kind of size you need, the kind of journalists you need, the kind of spread you need across the country, puts you back in the same revenue calculation where direct reach to your consumer is not going to get you money back. The kind of model, what I'm suggesting, where it is possible to pose alternatives is somewhere between a daily and weekly, which is looking at particular stories of interest, driving stories which are important, investing in long-term stories, doing investigative journalism. From my own calculations, personally, let me put down an amount which is not somewhere between a 5 crore to a 10 crore annual budget is enough today for an online portal to provide you the kind of journalism that will have a national impact, will make the national government sit and react, that can do good in-depth investigative stories, can engage with, it is not going to respond, it's not going to be your news portal, it's not going to give you the news of the day, it is not going to give you information about what is happening across the country, but it will take up important issues, communicate them in ways that are compelling, come up with large investigative stories, provide you opinion on what is happening in interesting fashions. And that is possible with this kind of budget. Question is, how do you create this kind of budget? What is the kind of consumer base you will need to fund this kind of thing? You would need, it's an easy calculation. Let's say you're charging 75 rupees a month. That's not much. That's monthly magazines cost this much. People are already paying for this much. That means you're charging about 900 a year. That means if you have a paid subscriber base of somewhere between 60,000 and 100,000, you are generating revenues in that range. Now, how do you get to that consumer base? The consumer base doesn't happen overnight. And this is where the problem lies. If such a website or such a series of websites, because these websites can exist either as individual websites, these can be specialized, whether they are dealing with business or economic policy, these websites will need to be functioning for 3 to 4 years before they get the kind of subscriber base that would make them self-sustaining. So what I'm saying is that if, and this is the important point, that if all of us believe that the media is not just a business, but is a matter of public good, where its interventions in our democracy are of great use and great necessity, then we have to find ways of public or private seeding which will allow such alternatives to come up over 3 years. So what would this need? I'm suggesting that this would need the kind of seed money of maybe about 15 crores over 3 years before it becomes a self-sustaining enterprise that is dependent only on its consumer base, is dealing with the government. And when I say dealing with the government, to me, I think I have a very simple definition of good journalism. A good journalistic organization's role is to interrogate the exercise of power, okay, which is non-ideological. It doesn't matter which government is sitting there. It is to exercise how power is, it is to ask questions of the kind of decisions that are made by those people in power. That kind of institution or several such institutions can be had only online if people are willing to consider public or private seeding of funds that may extend to maybe up to 15 crore for 3 years. Whether that portal will have the ability to pay back in 7 years, 10 years, I don't know. Whether that should be built into the model, I don't know. What I am suggesting is that the only possible real alternatives can come if somebody helps set up these kind of alternatives, which are not set up to subsist on grants in perpetuity, but are eventually headed toward self-sustaining possibilities. Short of that, what can be done? This is the ideal situation where you have not one, but maybe 6 or 7 or 10 portals across the country which are dealing with different areas, different subjects, dealing with whatever is happening, providing us with alternatives with which we can engage with. Short of that, what are the other interventions that can strengthen mass media itself? Sorry, before I go on to that, what is the kind of structure I'm proposing for these kind of online sort of one? These have to be the kind of structures you all are very familiar with. These have to be non-profit organizations. That is, they may provide salaries which match the best in the business, but they are not raising money from the market or are not raising money from third sources, which creates, again, another intervention in the direct relationship between the media and the market. So these are not ownerships with shares held by somebody where an owner owns 30% of the company. That kind of structure has the same problems inbuilt into it. The only kind of structure that will work to provide an actual real alternative to media are non-profit organizations paying salaries that match or at least compete with good media organizations in the world, in the country, and yet are able to draw that money from the consumer. And what I'm suggesting is that if you look at the numbers, this is actually possible online with initial help of whoever is willing to step in and intervene. Short of that, what are the other things that are possible? I think one of the strongest needs or challenges in this country are that we have not debated what kind of mass media we want in this country. What are the legal safeguards that can exist on mass media in this country? Who can own mass media in this country? Questions of ownership, questions of what owner can own which kind of mass media, questions of what are the legal rights of journalists working in mass media. If you take a stand on a matter of conscience, what are your rights legally in terms of fighting the management? We have not dwelt on that enough. What is the wall that separates your revenue earning market from your editorial market? We again have not debated enough. We have gone into default positions. The only act that exists is called the Working Journalist Act. That applies only to print. It was formulated in the 1950s. At that time, I think nobody conceived that television or online would be. So the only legal recourse available to journalists fighting management over points of principle does not extend to television journalists or online journalists. They cannot take legal recourse to the Working Journalist Act because they are not counted as journalists. So one is, of course, as I said, there are many possible interventions. One is simply how can we push mass media in a certain direction legally. The second is there are via medias. For example, at Caravan, where I'm working today, what we have proposed is we have set up a separate NGO, for example, again a not-for-profit NGO with transparent funding. So if somebody, it's still in the process of being formed. So if somebody comes and funds that NGO, that money is only to be used for journalistic stories. That money will not go into building up our infrastructure, getting another computer in the office. It will be detailed and broken down into this story, this reporter, this is the work we did, this is the published outcome. Again, this requires public participation in large manners. That is, as a society, we need to understand that there have to be sources of revenue which lie outside ordinarily available means which will fund this kind of journalistic intervention. That's another possibility. This kind of possibility can extend to various organizations. Take somebody like NDTV, which has worked itself into a corner financially and ethically, but still has some good journalists who have done long-form journalism. If people are willing to intervene and say, this is the kind of money available to an organization for these kind of stories by these journalists, and if the organization can show the kind of transparency that is needed, then by all means, I think there should be public participation in funding those kind of interventions. But in the end, as I'm saying, the only real alternative to mass media which will challenge the discourse is the kind of model I'm suggesting, not very small or very large, very much mainstream. This will deal with politics, it will deal with any kind of issues we are involved, but it will be in direct contact with the consumers and will be giving you good journalism. I said good journalism interrogates power. Good journalism must also do something more. It must tell stories well. It is not enough to be well-meaning or to be activist. It is not enough to say that I want to write about education. It is necessary to write about education in a way that interests you, that will make people read those stories, which is where the money comes in, which is where the investment comes in. So roughly, more or less, that is the broad summary of my talk, that we have a certain revenue model which creates certain compulsions. We have to find ways out of it. Those ways out can only take place if there is an understanding that the media is an institution that requires support from outside in setting up alternatives. If that doesn't happen, we will continue with what we have, whether it is online or offline. We will very much have the same kind of media that we already have. So that is roughly what I wanted to say. Questions, whatever you want to ask me, we can discuss and talk through.
This kind of a broad sort of publicly owned structure of the media, I mean, this is not completely new, right? I mean, you've seen experiments like this in the US. You have websites like TruthDig, Real News, and interesting kind of efforts which sort of use community funding to drive media efforts of the kind that you're talking about, independent journalism, speaking to power, so on and so forth. The question I had was slightly on the historical sense. I mean, when you look back pre-liberalization in India, we didn't really have publicly owned or community-owned kind of media. Then how did, in that context, speaking to power happen? And how do you contrast that? Has the ownership structure changed? Is this sort of a political economy within which media is embedded, has it changed? I mean, as a journalist for a long time, what are the key differences you see, which is disallowing or sort of narrowing the diversity of the discourse?
One is, I am not making the argument that the media has got worse. I've told you in many ways it has got better despite mass media. If you go back and actually look at, and I do it while looking at 84, looking at the questions of how important questions where the role of the government was suspect were covered, we are today better at it despite mass media than we were in the 70s, 60s, 50s. There were various reasons for it. I don't think the media then took the role of interrogation of power very seriously. They thought we were part of a collaborative building process of nationhood, for lack of better terms. Editors themselves saw themselves as advising governments, participating in government, stepping in and out of government. If you go back and look at some of the newspapers of that time, they make for pretty sad reading if you look at it. So this nostalgia that the media was better is just unfounded. It wasn't better. No, I agree. So media has got better. What I'm saying is, but this media, which is comparatively better, has its constraints. There are problems. We need to think beyond it. And in some senses, a revenue model where the consumer directly pays through circulation is no longer possible in print because the advertising revenue model drives out. Even at small sustainable basis, there are few examples that have done it because the cost of printing, the cost of circulation paper makes that you have to have certain amounts of print runs before your interaction with the public becomes viable. Though I'm saying it's only because online eliminates some of those costs that something like this is possible online, basically.
model of yours, like 75 per month and 100 rupees per year, can compete with those big media giants websites which are free on the basis of just good journalism? Because there are pretty good journalism in the website which are news portal which are free. So why would a consumer or reader would pay for that kind of stories which he can also just on the basis of good journalism? Can this model be successful?
Look, let's put it this way. You're not competing against them. You're placing alternatives out there. We are not looking at large numbers, Actually, 60,000 to 100,000, we are looking at it from 5 years from now, not even today. Even websites that are not updating, Caravan, of course the content is free. The question is, there is a difference in the kind of quality that mass media provides. It is not when one mass media competes against others. It does not make too much sense for them to invest large amounts of money into following one story. When you can get the same amount of eyeballs through a video of a cat doing handstands, you will not want to spend a lot of money collecting news. In that competition, certain stories die out. That is the kind of work that can be done by alternate. And what I'm saying is, it will not attract all the audience, but the audience I'm talking of is very, very small. Look at the numbers. If you go and look at the online figures, even by today's standards, these are not very large audiences. In 4 or 5 years, these are very sustainable and potentially plausible audiences to have, So, I mean, take one example of what happens in the competition between mass media. Call it the Times Now or the Arnab model. Prime time has today become a debating studio. People shouting at each other, excitement, event of the day. But look at the revenue of it. How much does it cost? Studio, fixed cost, anchor you're already paying. You get 6 guests, 8 guests, 4 from political parties, you don't pay them. You pay your guests 5,000. If they are from Pakistan, they get abused more, maybe you pay them more basically. So for 20, 25, 30,000, your program is made. To compete against this, if you were to do a half an hour good investigative piece on what is happening somewhere in the country, you would need 20 times the budget. And if you are getting more eyeballs doing this than that, and if you keep doing that in mass media, you will die out. It's the economics of the model that is killing that journalism. It is the choices much of the public is making that is killing that journalism. But what I'm suggesting is that online, if the numbers are enough, you can provide those alternatives because you don't want to attract everybody who's going online. You have to attract a very small segment of people there and convince them that what they are finding there is not available elsewhere. It's written in ways that's not available elsewhere and get them to pay for it. I think it's possible. I mean, the question is it can only be tried out and seen for what it is.
What about the representation of the different class people? Like there was a recently released book that is called, Media mein Dalit dhoondte reh jaoge. And don't you think, the media is dominated by certain class or caste of people? And why the media has become so much middle class oriented these days?
It was always this way. The problem is very simple. When I start by talking about English media, class and caste assumptions are built into the very use of the word English. The very dominance of English in the discourse in this country itself means that there is a class and caste assumption in terms of the discourse. You don't get Dalits in the media? Absolutely no. You do not get much diversity at all in the media. You get certain kind of educational backgrounds in the media. All these are hugely problematic. And they are all part of the kind of problems that we have to deal with. And those problems are inherent in this country. I'm not even suggesting the model I'm saying in terms of alternate stories or writing will actually do away with the problems you are saying. Those problems are far deeper ingrained in our country and our society to be undone in any single strand, whether in the media or in the private sector. They cannot be done away all at once by intervention in one single sphere. Those are hugely deep-rooted problems in the society that, we should be aware of and try to correct for those biases. But whether one particular element of society can undo those biases within itself, I don't think it's possible. I know that's not a very satisfactory answer. So the only thing we as journalists must remember and deal with is that these problems are there and we must try and correct for them. Can we make them go away? No, we can't. I don't think so.
I come from the technology space. I've looked at, so most people in the technology space follow Y Combinator, TechCrunch, and in India they follow Your Story, because Your Story. So all of these new startups in the technology space have over the time figured that they don't, the best way to make money is not through advertising on their sites, but to actually have events offline. Like, so TechCrunch does a Disrupt, which annual, where you have like 200 startups that turn up, come up with an idea and do it. And the ticketing is how they make money. And Your Story in India is trying to do something similar. So that's one model that I've seen work. So I'm just...
Let's come back to that.
Yeah, so
it works in tech. We call it native advertising in various forms or the other. It's not new to online. Look at Tehelka. ThinkFest, it was drawing in amounts of money. But it doesn't run away from the essential problem that I'm talking about. If Tehelka has SR as its sponsor, and if it wants to do stories against SR's mining, then it doesn't matter whether that money is for an event or it is for advertising in the magazine. The pressure that exists on you is the same. In the technology sphere, I don't know how these people deal with it. If the mandate is different, if you're pushing products, you're writing about products, but will these websites, if they become dependent on funding from one particular technology source, be critically examining that technology within the website? I don't think that's going to happen. I mean, it has nothing to do with any of these portals individually. That is in the very nature. You cannot undermine what sustains you over the long term. So that problem is built into it, whether you do it through native advertising or you do it advertising through the site. Native advertising is one of the ways online portals are going, because right now there is no direct advertising to fund them. And we will see a lot more of that. Events organized, conferences organized, ideas discussed. But the sources of funding are still the same corporate funding, whether it comes through advertising or these means, and it imposes the same kind of influences and pressures, basically.
I just have some more follow-up question as well as some more questions. So you've talked about native advertising, right? So not just looking at the tech space, you even have Time, the Time magazine dedicate a new 8-member team to have native advertising in their magazines. You can't even make out whether it's a news piece or it's a fluff piece or it's an ad. So that's one thing on how you can look at that. So I wanted to ask you about how Caravan has done it, because I've been reading Caravan for quite a couple of years now, and they started off as just the site. You don't have the print thing that came out recently, as in probably a year or so, 2 years or so.
Actually, it's the other way around, but that's the magazines existed for 5 years. The website is only 2 years old, but I mean that depends on how you relate with the medium. You may have come to it from the website first.
Yes, yes.
So, look. Caravan is not at the moment breaking even. The reason it survives is because it's a media house of the Delhi Press Group, which also brings out a huge host of Hindi magazines, including Champak, Grashobha, Sarita, and there is cross-funding from those. So it's at least a sustainable media business where other media magazines put money into it. Caravan is not making huge losses either, and it is getting better simply because, as I said, established houses have it easier because there's already infrastructure. They don't have to invest in a printing press. It was already there because it was a media house. They don't have to invest necessarily in a large circulation or an ad department. You don't need to invest in office space, computers. As compared to a startup, it had many things that it was not required to do. So its costs or losses at the moment are low, but that it is breaking even, no, that's not true. Sure, we'll come back to it. If you have questions, I'll take them on. If you have the time, I'll quite willing to. Yeah.
Hello, sir. Isn't the model that you've suggested a very addresses to a very specific niche group of people over here? Because then we're just restricting good journalism to people who can pay for this. So there's a moral conflict that I face over that. Somehow people who seek for good journalism and can't pay for it, they just don't get it, or?
No, fairly valid point. First of all, I am proposing that this is not very, as an alternative to current scenarios, where the same problem already exists, that people only, so I'm just not planning to solve all the problems, but what also happens is, this kind of model, if it becomes economically sustainable, will actually not exist where everything is to be paid for. I think what most websites, even something like this, would eventually get to is a mixed model where you have a certain core of your website behind paywalls, some of it available free publicly. There is no other alternative. That's the only way that you will evolve. I'm not getting into the technicalities or the specificities of how this website will plan its strategy, how much of that content will be free, how much will be paid for. I'm just pointing out this is the kind of revenue that has to flow in. This is the kind of revenue it needs to break even. If beyond that, if it is putting out free content that generates advertising revenue, I don't think any website like this should shy away from it, as long as it remembers that what makes it financially sustainable is available directly from its readers. Beyond that, what is possible is, there is nothing stopping any kind of free access, collection of advertising, whatever other sources there are.
Simple question. I just want to know what your daily media diet is like. Your daily media diet?
Okay. I still read the newspapers mostly. Yeah. Actually, the one newspaper I still read with reasonable focus, unfortunately you don't get it in this part of the country, is the Indian Express. I was talking about this earlier. The edition, not the edition that comes out here, certainly not. Okay. The Indian Express in the north has a broad base of reporters located across the country. And I'm saying that one of the most important things that newspapers or large organizations could provide is reportage from across the country. Because, if you look at this entire model of online news that is being generated, you have this surfeit of opinion. People are spouting opinion without necessarily any foundation. But at the bottom of all these opinions is the few good reported pieces that are coming from across the country. Most of the online sites don't want to pay for reportage. They will build on other people's reportage, write about it. In that process, undermine the revenue model for the reportage. So ultimately, one day you may get to the point where you're writing opinions without any reportage happening at all. That is the most worrying aspect. But so what the Express is doing may have differences with its opinion page, edit pages, its editorial policy, even some of the news choices. But the fact is, it is still giving you a huge amount of reportage from across the country. That to me is actually one of the most important things that can be done by a media organization. Then I read 5 or 6 other newspapers. I read 1 or 2 pink newspapers because one should know that how a small set of people have disproportionate influence on the kind of policies that are shaped in this country. That is the reason I look at the pink papers. I personally don't find much of the content very interesting, but I still look at it because I think it's necessary. Magazines, very little, because for me, both India Today and Outlook have, Outlook still occasionally, that's not true, but certainly India Today has of no use at all in terms of how I am processing news. Look at some foreign publications, The Atlantic, The New Yorker, see what is coming out occasionally. That is the kind of stuff. I will also pick up 1 or 2 Hindi newspapers sitting in Delhi, definitely. The Bhaskar, the Jagran, and see what is coming out there.
Yes, I see it is always a problem to confirm a news, whether it is right or wrong. So my question is that, is there any legal issue that a publisher has to face if they're publishing a paid news? Like, can you comment on that, please?
Well, clearly, I think the guidelines are already, they should not be publishing paid news. It is illegal. They face legal sanction. But, the law is eminently flexible, or at least can be made eminently flexible if you have enough smart people designing ways in which you collect advertising. For example, the Times has set up this whole kind of Times Treaty, which was basically you buy into shares of part equity in a startup, and it's supposed to be totally removed from the news business. But several editors or journalists within the Times of India have said that there was a sort of maybe unwritten clarity that certain kinds of news about these organizations will never get into the paper. The other way around, media organizations during elections, actually this question of paid news that you're asking, whether some news is actually paid for, is to me personally far less of the threat than the fact that a great amount of the news which is not paid for is influenced in a certain direction or the other in ways that can never be legally captured. And that influence comes from advertisers, largely from advertisers and owners, because politicians today directly lack, it is far easier to criticize a politician today than a corporate house in this country. And that is for this very reason, because of the model that we have chosen, the advertiser holds influence. A politician can only intervene not directly by dealing with a journalist, but can talk to the owner whose business could be troubled by the politician. So the owner will say, let's avoid this or let's avoid that, basically. And that to me, despite the fact that paid news should be fought against, definitely be addressed, to me, it is not by any means the biggest threat facing the media today.
Two questions. One about the consumers of the media. Like recently, like a lot of, a couple of foreign news organizations, I wouldn't call BuzzFeed a news organization, but they're trying, and courts have kind of come into India. So what does that say about the kind of consumer there is now? And also in terms of, are there still readers for long form, or have you seen like a reverse where is there any hope that there will be people who will still be consumers of long form? And as online, like, isn't it just, does online ever get to stretching publications' resources too thin? Because it's not just about having your website, it's about having Facebook or Twitter, and does that like affect the quality of the news at all?
Well, several questions. It's interesting. BuzzFeed has expanded rapidly. And as I said, cats doing handstands is sort of one of the kind of items that will drive BuzzFeed traffic. Now, interestingly, what has happened is that they've also invested in long form recently. They are trying to put money in because it is no surprise that BuzzFeed is not among the most trusted sources of news in the world. And they want to challenge that perception because I've drawn out broad contours. Advertising is not just about the numbers you get, it's also the kind of numbers you get, what those numbers think about the content they are reading. So, but the fact is that BuzzFeed can expand this rapidly and then make some alterations to put in certain changes does not take away from the problematic nature of the whole enterprise. It is still going to be at its core about cats doing handstands with one or two long form pieces thrown in. That is going to be the character of BuzzFeed as far as I'm concerned. To answer the second part of the question, tweeting, Facebook, no. I think that investment compared to the kind of investment that went into a circulation department and an advertising department is actually far less of an investment. It is not that difficult, especially if you're not mass media, because you are updating people only about at most 1 or 2 or 3 stories a day. That's not very difficult. Any one individual can keep track of that, basically. Yes.
So, which is the most difficult story that you have done?
See, difficulties are of several kinds, but I will tell you that it doesn't take much saying that clearly from the time we got hold of it, the repercussions were quite clear when the Radia tapes came to us at Open, And I actually sat and processed those tapes for over a month and a half, sharing it with maybe just 1 or 2 of my reporters, hearing it. And from the very beginning, it was quite clear what the ramifications of that story were. So it wasn't difficult in doing it because it was just a question of getting everything transcribed, cross-checking, making sure that these are not forgeries in some ways, making sure the various accounts tally. The difficulty was in whether we could ever get it into print. And the simple fact is, what we did is, we did not tell the publisher or the owner that this was the story that was going on the cover. Me and my editor, Manu Joseph, who also quit Open Magazine, between us, we sent it to cover. We were not sure whether it would be stopped at the printing press. We were not sure whether these copies would actually get from the printing press to the market. So the owner of the organization, the publisher of the organization who's in charge of advertising circulation, none of them saw what we were doing till it was actually out there in print available to the public. So difficult in that sense. One of the questions that was asked to us is that why did you not get the responses of those people who were named in the radio tapes? Practically speaking, the answer is pretty clear. Ethically speaking, should we have got those answers ideally in an ideal world? Yes, we should have contacted each one and got them. Practically speaking, as journalists, and these are the choices you have to make, you knew that each one of the persons whose tapes we were reproducing had the power to get the story stopped as soon as they knew that we were going to run the story. There was no way we could have contacted those people, got the responses, and seen the tapes actually see the light of day. That's the choice we made. And I still think that was the right choice, basically.
See, for organizations like News Laundry and The Hoot, who are trying to sort of act as a watchdog over other media organizations, do you see them making any sort of impact whatsoever?
Look, and let me date this back to the radio tapes. If the media has this disproportionate influence on our lives, and it does, then it was very important that media write about media. And I mean, one of the taboos we broke with the radio tape story was that we actually named and spoke and criticized media people involved in the tapes. It says something for the ethical standards of our industry, of our media, that those people still continue to be in the media. That includes Veer Sanghvi writing on politics, that includes Parkhadat anchoring shows. But that is the ethical nature of society and media that we have created for ourselves. For that very reason, I think these sites, big or small, have a very important role. And yes, people in the media are wary of these issues being covered. For that very reason, I think they are pretty essential.
So you were telling us that Carvaan is also planning to make a non-profit organization to implement the same model that you've proposed right now.
Not the scheme. What we are proposing is something much simpler, that we will go tell people, look, in our case, you already know the journalism we do. What we want is people to step forth and give us funding for exactly our journalism, nothing else. We are not asking that people step in to pay our salaries, pay for our computers, pay for our infrastructure. We will give you a detailed accounting of how much money was spent on which story, which journalist traveled where, how much was spent on gathering news. That's a much simpler proposition. We are just saying that we want to expand our ability to do those kind of stories. And if people are willing to come forward, I don't mean individuals, it has to be larger donations. I mean, individuals can just buy our copy or become subscribers. So the idea is that basically. How do we?
My question is why is Carvaan planning to make a non-profit organization separately? Why can't it, with its own subscriber base, try to be sustainable on the donation, on the money of the subscribers?
Well, at the moment, as I said, there is a cross-subsidy going on. It's not a non-for-profit organization. It already has an inherited structure where a family owns it, is running it. That's the way it has come into existence. So the reason we are saying that we are setting up a separate non-profit organization is that for anybody funding it should not have the impression that this is money going to finance a particular family, a particular media organization, etc. Just make it clear transparently, this is what we are using it for. You can come check it, this is where the money will go. That's basically our intention, that's all.
I have one more question. Since News Laundry was also mentioned,
Sure.
News Laundry is also trying to fund itself based on the subscriber money. So I have no idea about the subscriber base they have right now, and it seems like they still haven't break
As I said,
even,
it's a 4 or 5 year process. I think our digital consumer or reader is not prepared at the moment to pay the kind of money. I'm saying that as the media landscape changes, as they become habituated, in a period of 4 or 5 years, this is going to become more and more possible. The thing is, how do you sustain organizations in this period? News Laundry has ways of sustaining itself, but then alternatives should not depend on somebody having individual money or for whatever sources of money. If various alternatives have to exist. We have to find a way of publicly funding them so that they become real alternatives. That's all I'm suggesting.
What is the role of government in regulating and scrutinizing media houses?
Look, the role of government is decided by legislation, and at the moment our legislation is pretty cumbersome. The government doesn't have enough controls on who can own media, cross ownership of media. It doesn't have much control of what can a owner of a print organization have several business interests. Is that okay or is it not okay? If you have steel plants and you're running a media organization, what if the government doesn't give you permit for coal, for example? Will that change the stance of your magazine? Quite possible. Should such a person own media? Probably not, depending on how society thinks of it, but we haven't thought of these questions and legislated them. What, on the other hand, is a set of old arcane British rules on how you can register a newspaper, what allows certain people to publish a newspaper, not register it. The government can then use those indirectly to influence or control owners. So at the moment, we have the wrong kind of ownership and regulation. They can put pressure on owners to do the kind of things the government wants them to do, but we don't have structural government regulations which actually prevent misuse of power by owners, basically.
Are things like All India Radio and stuff like, are they also influenced and manipulated, or is this?
They're directed and dictated to you. So, I mean, there's no question of influence. One of the most important things, and this is a question I think you were asking in terms of how do you get news to the vast majority of this population where there are questions of caste, access, etc. And one of the most iniquitous things that has happened in this country, and this is a deliberate government decision, is that news is not allowed on radio for anybody other than All India Radio. It is simply for that reason, because that will allow the kind of access and penetration of news that no other medium gives you. The government has deliberately shied away from it.
Just a curious doubt. Some few years ago, Mr. Mukesh Ambani's son met with an accident. So
not very far back, yeah, quite recently. Yeah.
So how come no media house covered that?
I mean, you are answering the question, aren't you? Yeah.
No, but someone should, right?
Absolutely, somebody should, right? Which is why I'm saying that corporate ownership, the revenue model, all these issues have such problems built into it, because this is exactly what will happen when you have this kind of media.
There could be one honest media house.
There were some small news items that appeared, but the kind of outrage or questioning that incidents like this should have generated do not happen. And that is precisely for the reasons that I've given you, basically.
Hi, sir. I just wanted to know, under the present political dispensation, do you think a story like the Seemanand story that Caravan had run would have been possible? I mean, do you think there's more pressure now under the present government?
Look, to be fair to this government, directly there has been no pressure to stop us from doing anything. Under those circumstances, if we had the story today, we would run it today, as far as I know. What would happen afterwards is something we'll find out later. But what is frightening about the media, and this is where corporate ownership comes in, that without any direct threat from this government, the media caved in anticipation of that threat, that we better be good to this government, otherwise this government will do something to us. The government hasn't had to do anything. They've got a very good press without even trying to make them kowtow or bend or etc. These people are crawling even when they have not been asked to bend, basically. That is what has happened with the media.
So, I mean, Caravan has this investigative style of journalism. Now that you're saying, the management tends to kowtow, does this kind of, affect your process of,
It hasn't happened here in Caravan. It hasn't so far. I mean, no such indication at all.
All right.
Okay. So, I mean, clearly, if you will look at our issues, what we've been writing, if you go to our website, we have now just web-only content already on the website. And if you look at all those things together, there is no sign that in any way our editorial policy today is any different from what it was under the previous government. Certainly, I mean, as an individual, I don't practically think I will do anything differently. And if I'm asked to, I think this is something I always insist as a journalist, that my responsibility is to my profession, not to my owner, basically. That is what you have to actually write according to. Okay.
For the concerns you have.
See, mine may not be the most complimentary view of journalism schools, simply because I think journalism is not, journalism is a craft. And like every other craft, you have to learn by doing it. What journalism schools sort of give you when you go to an interview, I think an organization realizes that you are serious about this career because you've already invested a year, 2 years, or 3 years in the profession. Whether I would give story, an important story, or to somebody just fresh off journalism school, no. We would, I think, run them through the entire gamut of the kind of training which cannot happen at a journalism school because it's a craft that must be learnt on the job. That's where all the training will happen. So I think in that sense, they are only in some ways proof of commitment to profession as far as I see it. That's yeah. Okay. I think we are done now. Great. Thank you.